Chapter 3. It was, I think, on the 5th day, though in this detail his story sometimes varied, that he made a definite discovery which increased his alarm and brought him up to a rather sharp climax. Before that, he had already noticed that a change was going forward, and certain subtle transformations being brought about in his character which modified several of his minor habits, and he affected to ignore them. Here, however, was something he could no longer ignore, and it startled him. At the best of times, he was never very positive, always negative, rather, compliant and acquiescent. Yet, when the necessity arose, he was capable of reasonably vigorous action, and could take a strongish decision. The discovery he now made that brought him up with such a sharp turn was that this power had positively dwindled to nothing. He found it impossible to make up his mind, for on this 5th day he realized that he had stayed long enough in the town, and that for reasons he could only vaguely define to himself, it was wiser and safer that he should leave. And he found that he could not leave. This is difficult to describe in words, and it was more by gesture and the expression of his face that he conveyed to Dr. Silence the state of impotence he had reached. All this spying and watching, he said, had, as it were, spun a net about his feet, so that he was trapped and powerless to escape. He felt like a fly that had blundered into the intricacies of a great spider web. He was caught, imprisoned, and could not get away. It was a distressing sensation. A numbness had crept over his will till it had become almost incapable of decision. The mere thought of vigorous action towards escape, began to terrify him. All the currents of his life had turned inwards upon himself, striving to bring to the surface something that lay buried almost beyond reach, determined to force his recognition of something he had long forgotten years upon years, centuries almost, ago. It seemed as though a window deep within his being would presently open and reveal an entirely new world, yet somehow a world that was not unfamiliar. Beyond that, again, he fancied a great curtain hung, and when that too rolled up, he would see still farther into this region, and at last understand something of the secret life of these extraordinary people. Is this why they wait and watch? He asked himself with rather a shaking heart, for the time when I shall join them, or refuse to join them. Does the decision rest with me after all, and not with them? And it was at this point that the sinister character of the adventure first really declared itself, and he became genuinely alarmed. The stability of his rather fluid little personality was at stake, he felt, and something in his heart turned coward. Why otherwise should he have suddenly taken to walking stealthily, silently, making as little sound as possible, forever looking behind him? Why else should he have moved almost on tiptoe about the passages of the practically deserted inn, and when he was abroad have found himself deliberately taking advantage of what cover presented itself? And why, if he was not afraid, should the wisdom of staying indoors after sundown have suddenly occurred to him as eminently desirable? Why, indeed? And when John Silence gently pressed him for an explanation of these things, he admitted apologetically that he had none to give. It was simply that I feared something might happen to me unless I kept a sharp lookout. I felt afraid. It was instinctive, was all he could say. I got the impression that the whole town was after me, wanted me for something, and that if it got me, I should lose myself, or at least the self I knew, in some unfamiliar state of consciousness. But I am not a psychologist, you know, he added meekly, and I cannot define it better than that. It was while lounging in the courtyard half an hour before the evening meal that Vezin made this discovery, and he at once went upstairs to his quiet room at the end of the winding passage to think it over alone. In the yard it was empty enough, true, but there was always the possibility that the big woman whom he dreaded would come out of some door with her pretense of knitting to sit and watch him. This had happened several times, and he could not endure the sight of her. He still remembered his original fancy, bizarre though it was, that she would spring upon him the moment his back was turned and land with one single crushing leap upon his neck. Of course it was nonsense, but then it haunted him, and once an idea begins to do that, it ceases to be nonsense. It has clothed itself in reality. He went upstairs accordingly. It was dusk, and the oil lamps had not yet been lit in the passages. He stumbled over the uneven surface of the ancient flooring, passing the dim outlines of doors along the corridor, doors that he had never once seen opened, rooms that seemed never occupied. He moved, as his habit now was, stealthily and on tiptoe. Halfway down the last passage to his own chamber, there was a sharp turn, and it was just here, while groping round the walls with outstretched hands, that his fingers touched something that was not wall, something that moved. It was soft and warm in texture, indescribably fragrant, and about the height of his shoulder, and he immediately thought of a furry, sweet-smelling kitten. The next minute he knew it was something quite different. Instead of investigating, however, his nerves must have been too overwrought for that, he said. He shrank back as closely as possible against the wall on the other side. The thing, whatever it was, slipped past him with the sound of rustling, and, retreating with light footsteps down the passage behind him, was gone. A breath of warm, scented air was wafted to his nostrils. Vezin caught his breath for an instant and paused, stock-still, half leaning against the wall, and then almost ran down the remaining distance and entered his room with a rush, locking the door hurriedly behind him. Yet it was not fear that made him run. It was excitement, pleasurable excitement. His nerves were tingling, and a delicious glow made itself felt all over his body. In a flash it came to him that this was just what he had felt 25 years ago as a boy when he was in love for the first time. Warm currents of life ran all over him, and mounted to his brain in a whirl of soft delight. His mood was suddenly becoming tender, melting, loving. The room was quite dark, and he collapsed upon the sofa by the window, wondering what had happened to him and what it all meant. But the only thing he understood clearly in that instant was that something in him had swiftly, magically changed. He no longer wished to leave, or to argue with himself about leaving. The encounter in the passageway had changed all that. The strange perfume of it still hung about him, bemusing his heart and mind. For he knew that it was a girl who had passed him, a girl's face that his fingers had brushed in the darkness, and he felt in some extraordinary way as though he had been actually kissed by her, kissed full upon the lips. Trembling, he sat upon the sofa by the window and struggled to collect his thoughts. He was utterly unable to understand how the mere passing of a girl in the darkness of a narrow passageway could communicate so electric a thrill to his whole being that he still shook with the sweetness of it. Yet there it was, and he found it as useless to deny as to attempt analysis. Some ancient fire had entered his veins, and now ran coursing through his blood, and that he was 45 instead of 20 did not matter one little jot. Out of all the inner turmoil and confusion emerged the one salient fact that the mere atmosphere, the merest casual touch of this girl, unseen, unknown in the darkness, had been sufficient to stir dormant fires in the center of his heart, and rouse his whole being from a state of feeble sluggishness to one of tearing and tumultuous excitement. After a time, however, the number of Vezin's years began to assert their cumulative power. He grew calmer, and when a knock came at length upon his door, and he heard the waiter's voice suggesting that dinner was nearly over, he pulled himself together and slowly made his way downstairs into the dining-room. Everyone looked up as he entered, for he was very late, but he took his customary seat in the far corner and began to eat. The trepidation was still in his nerves, but the fact that he had passed through the courtyard and hall without catching sight of a petticoat served to calm him a little. He ate so fast that he had almost caught up with the current stage of the table d'hôte, when a slight commotion in the room drew his attention. His chair was so placed that the door and the greater portion of the long salle à manger were behind him, yet it was not necessary to turn round to know that the same person he had passed in the dark passage had now come into the room. He felt the presence long before he heard or saw anyone. Then he became aware that the old men, the only other guests, were rising one by one in their places and exchanging greetings with someone who passed among them from table to table. And when, at length, he turned with his heart beating furiously to ascertain for himself, he saw the form of a young girl, lithe and slim, moving down the center of the room and making straight for his own table in the corner. She moved wonderfully, with sinuous grace, like a young panther, and her approach filled him with such delicious bewilderment that he was utterly unable to tell at first what her face was like, or discover what it was about the whole presentment of the creature that filled him anew with trepidation and delight. "Ah, mademoiselle est de retour," he heard the old waiter murmur at his side, and he was just able to take in that she was the daughter of the proprietress when she was upon him, and he heard her voice. She was addressing him. Something of red lips he saw, and laughing white teeth, and stray wisps of fine dark hair about the temples, but all the rest was a dream in which his own emotion rose like a thick cloud before his eyes, and prevented his seeing accurately or knowing exactly what he did. He was aware that she greeted him with a charming little bow, that her beautiful large eyes looked searchingly into his own, that the perfume he had noticed in the dark passage again assailed his nostrils, and that she was bending a little towards him and leaning with one hand on the table at his side. She was quite close to him. That was the chief thing he knew, explaining that she had been asking after the comfort of her mother's guests, and now was introducing herself to the latest arrival, himself. "Monsieur has already been here a few days," he heard the waiter say, and then her own voice, sweet as singing, replied, "Ah, but monsieur is not going to leave us just yet, I hope. My mother is too old to look after the comfort of our guests properly. But now I am here, I will remedy all that." She laughed deliciously. "Monsieur shall be well looked after." Vezin, struggling with his emotion and desire to be polite, half rose to acknowledge the pretty speech, and to stammer some sort of reply, but as he did so, his hand by chance touched her own that was resting upon the table, and a shock that was for all the world like a shock of electricity passed from her skin into his body. His soul wavered and shook deep within him. He caught her eyes fixed upon his own with the look of most curious intentness, and the next moment he knew that he had sat down wordless again on his chair, that the girl was already halfway across the room, and that he was trying to eat his salad with a dessert spoon and a knife. Longing for her return, and yet dreading it, he gulped down the remainder of his dinner, and then went at once to his bedroom to be alone with his thoughts. This time the passages were lighted, and he suffered no exciting contretemps, yet the winding corridor was dim with shadows, and the last portion from the bend of the wall onwards seemed longer than he had ever known it. It ran downhill like the pathway on a mountainside, and as he tiptoed softly down it, he felt that by rights it ought to have led him clean out of the house into the heart of a great forest. The world was singing with him. Strange fancies filled his brain, and once in the room, with the door securely locked, he did not light the candles, but sat by the open window, thinking long, long thoughts that came unbidden in troops to his mind.